everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a new Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison, and I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, and I'm joined by some amazing people who will all introduce themselves when we start our word association. So today we're talking about tech and democracy, and everyone can say 1 to 3 words that they associate with that topic. And before that, just introduce yourself.
Okay, cool. Hey everyone, my name is Ashley. I am a high school senior in Vancouver, Washington. My 3 words are ethics, literacy, and inclusion. So like ethics, because I feel like, tech is inherently not neutral and it is up to humans to decide how they want to use it. Literacy, because you need to be able to have a basic understanding of technology to apply it to shift systems. And inclusion, because I feel like that's where tech is really powerful, is just its ability to reach a bunch of people and include people in decision-making processes.
Hi everyone, I would be happy to go next. My name is Chabu. I'm 19 years old and a first year at the University of Toronto, also based in Toronto. And when I think of tech and democracy, relevant is the first word that comes up to mind. I can't stress enough how relevant tech is to building democracy or the current state of democracy. And that's definitely a mental model that I had to develop recently. That wasn't always something I believed. And then also, I think that informative is important. Tech informs our democratic systems, but I don't think our democratic systems inform tech, and that's like a really unhealthy dynamic. And so, yeah, those are my 2 thoughts on that.
Awesome. Am I going next?
Yeah, you can.
Cool.
Abigail, you can go later if you want. You can take a
Yeah, good. Cool. So thank you guys for having me. My name's Mohit. Been known Josh for since about 4 years now. I worked on his New York mayoral campaign, so that's how I got introduced to Civics Unplugged. A little bit about me. I'm originally from Mumbai, India. I grew up there, moved to New York when I was 18. I've been in New York for about approaching 9 years now. Love politics. I studied politics and economics in undergrad at NYU. Currently, I have my own startup working in direct-to-consumer sustainable fashion. I have 2 jewelry brands. And now also on the side, I've been political consulting on and off for the last 3.5, 4 years as well. Excited to have this conversation. My 3 words for this conversation is history. One of the words is history. I think it's important to understand the time in which we're in, and also looking back at how tech has developed into what it is today, and how it has affected us in the last decade, 2 decades, and all starting in the 90s. And it's interesting to see how it's developed getting to this point. Censorship, I think the time in which we are today has censorship is a super interesting and relevant topic. Talking about regimes like China, India, and other democracies, and also now what's going on in the US today. It's super interesting to see how tech and democracy work with censorship or without censorship. And then invention, what's new and what can be done to actually take the relationship between tech and democracy forward.
If anyone else wants to jump in for their 3 words.
Yeah, I guess I can go ahead and do mine. So kind of cheating on these, I'm going to put Audrey Tang, Gary, and disruption. The reason why I say Audrey Tang and Gary is before I was introduced to the world of CU, I had never really thought deeply about the connection between tech and democracy. I had a very linear view of what civics and government meant. I basically equated it with politics, which now I realize was like very naive. And so seeing the role that Gary has played beyond his transition between like he's like obviously like way more than like technical support now, and then like the way that Audrey Tang, her work with integrating tech into Taiwan's democracy has just been phenomenal. And then also the reason why I say disruption is I'm going to reference the Rethink Humanity report again, but what they say in that is just so profound because it talks about how progressions in technology don't just affect sectors like information because of like how like they're just so impactful that they change everything, and that's ranging from democracy to like every single way that we lead our lives. And so technology has been like a big disruption in all the sectors and has changed everything and every part of our lives. So yeah.
Great points. I'll say feedback loops because tech very much amplifies a lot of like the character of the people, the societies using the tech. And there's a lot of pathologies that are kind of running rampant in our society that are being massively magnified through our tech right now.
Gary, you didn't introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Hey, I'm Gary. I'm one of the co-founders of CU. Mohit's awesome. So glad that he's hanging out with us tonight. Yeah, Mohit has been helping with CU ever since the beginning. I'm calling from New York City, and Mohit, even though he's at the CU office right now, lives like right next to me. So like a fun little fact.
I can go. Hi, I'm Leora. I was a founding fellow. I think words that came to mind were like enormous potential, because on one hand, there's enormous potential for good when combining tech and democracy, and enormous potential for bad. So just a lot of things that could be an outcome of that.
Abigail, are you ready to share your words? Oh, or Julia, you're back. Either one of you.
The word I thought of was like improvement.
Abigail, why does that word come to mind?
I don't know. I feel like we've improved a lot in this area, and also there's room for more improvement.
Julia, do you have your words?
Oh gosh, okay. I think I would say like ketchup, not ketchup, ketchup. And I'd say that because like I think the day-to-day operations of our government are like what 10 years behind on tech or something like that. So it's kind of just a little unsettling that tech is like becoming more so every day the forefront of people's lives, and everyone who is governing us is years behind. I don't like that, so yeah.
Cool. Thank you all for sharing. So now we can move on to the actual discussion, which is where anyone can pose a question or provocation, and then we get to talk about it.
I can start off. I think a good first question would be, what is the connection between tech and democracy?
I can go. So I guess for me it's interesting to see. I would love to hear your guys' opinion on it in terms of where we're at with tech and democracy. I think looking back, if we look at the baseline of tech really getting into forming democracy and affecting it in a very significant way, I would say in the United States it started out with the '08 Obama campaign, and I think that was sort of the starting point of. And I think that's why I chose history as my first word, because it's always interesting to look at where the first effect of technology came into place in terms of, you know, and in terms of politics as we know it. But it's interesting that I bring it up in the context of politics based on what Madison said about the fact that conflating democracy and politics is an interesting thing that always happens. I think looking a little bit further back, it's also interesting to see the baseline of tech in terms of even just things like email or statistics or calculations and statistical modeling for looking at like different outcomes and things like that, looking beyond just the internet and social media as tech, in terms of how it's had an impact on democracy. And then if you zoom further back and sort of look at the larger view, I think one of the most interesting things is looking at, if you even look at something like the printing press all the way back as tech, and that being the first point of starting to spread democracy and the ability to spread knowledge through democracy, right? Through technology. And so I think contextualizing it in history is always interesting in terms of how we can think about the relationship between the two.
So true.
That's really interesting. I'd hardly ever think of things going all the way back to the printing press as tech, but it totally is. I guess just with how I've been, I'm only 18 years old and I've only ever kind of known tech to be referring to something electronic, but that is not definitely its original purpose. So that is a really interesting connection that I just would not have thought about. I think for me, the first thing I think of is just electronic voting, which is actually a really fascinating thing. If you look into all the different types of electronic voting across states and how they actually have to design it in a very particular way as to not confuse people with ballot questions and things on the ballot. And there is actually a lot of interesting pitfalls to that I read a little bit about before. So that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah, I definitely agree with those as well. And I think that something that's worth mentioning is what is democracy? So democracy is composed of the people. So I think that anything that largely affects the people on the way that they live their lives also will have will strongly inform democracy and how we participate with it. So it doesn't just have to be tech. Tech has largely influenced and changed how we do everything. And I think it could be also applicable to other things like culture, the songs that we listen to, the movies that we watch, anything that really fundamentally changes the way that people live their lives is going to inherently have a huge impact on our organizing systems like democracy.
I think that it's really interesting how you brought up the example of the printing press being technology, because it is just maybe not the depth of technology that we're familiar with, but it's most definitely technology, which makes me want to reframe how I look at the word technology. And it's really just tools that are used, and the technology that informs democracy the most is definitely any tool that expands communication or understanding of the state of the democracy. So the printing press that informed newspapers and allowed them to be able to communicate better across streams in the same way that social media has been able to do that. And so I think the connection is just the fact that it's almost a way to crowdsource the perspective, or to see a lot of views of different populations and collectives kind of take surface and be seen if you're not, if you don't have firsthand experience in those spaces.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I guess like when I think about democracy, like I think about people able to have like people engaging in dialogue and having productive conversations about meaningful issues as like one part of it, and then the other part of it as being like people have like meaningful say in whatever decisions are being made without like distortion from like elite groups, and like everyone can have a voice. And so I guess like yeah, so I definitely just agree with that in the sense that like I feel like tech can make information a lot more accessible, so people can have those meaningful discussions. And then to what Leora was talking about, kind of like with like voting, and like I think other applications that allow people to have a voice in whatever decisions are being made. I guess like something I like also think about is like virtual testifying, because that I mean that's something like a couple of years ago I was just like working with a lot of students on like the east side of Washington state, which like is not very represented in our state legislature, just because like no one is going to drive 6 hours to Olympia and testify on bills, especially when you're a high school student. So that's something my mind just goes to.
I also like was thinking about like the root of the word technology, which I'm pretty sure is Greek. And like it's interesting because like techne, which is the thing it comes from, can mean like art or craft or really anything like that. And so we very often don't think of technology in this terms of like it's an art, it's a craft, but it is. And so just to make that connection of like kind of like the artistry of democracy, as weird as that may sound.
That's interesting. I think a lot of people, maybe this is just me, but like, especially before, as I mentioned, like saw like art and tech as like opposites. So it's crazy to think that the root is that.
Here's a provocation. Culture and processes are technology.
My like initial thought in response to this kind of speaks to like qualities that they share. So culture and processes are sometimes very hard to like explicitly see in different spaces. Like it's very hard to know the culture of the space, or it's very hard to like depict the processes that they use. And it's also very hard to witness when like technology is being influential, or like to understand just like the extent of its implications. I don't think until like 2016 and even this like last election, we truly understood just how much like rhetoric on social media has depicted literally different versions of reality for different Americans. So yeah, I think that they're both extremely powerful, but we're yet to arrive to like a true understanding of just like how powerful they are, because they're also kind of subtle in a way.
Super interesting. The actually the first thing that I thought about when you said that, Gary, is the pyramids of Giza. Again, going back to history, because it's like, how do you look at, like, till date, there's so many different theories on how we actually got to the pyramids of Giza in terms of the building process, which is obviously using a form of primitive technology, albeit some form of technology, but it speaks to the culture and processes of the time, right? In terms of what the social dynamics of a pharaoh with tens of thousands of slaves, actually lugging like massive tons of sandstone about, and so that was the first thing I thought of in terms of how technology of the time represents the culture of the time. But in terms of the sort of opposite, I do think, going back to what you were saying earlier, I think Gary was saying it, but basically, if you look at today and you look at culture and processes, I think just looking at culture in and of itself, like technology may be representative of culture, but it's in the echo chambers that you're within, right? And so it's not necessarily representative of cultural identity outside of your echo chamber, in the sense that it's representative of a whole. It's representative of parts of a whole in a lot of ways. And I think that's because of the way, I think somebody was talking about technology as a tool, and I think that's super interesting. Actually, I don't know if all of y'all have sorry, I'm jumping a bit around, but if you've seen Notion's about page about how it was created, if you haven't, you should check it out. But it talks about how an original desk was first converted into, say, Word and Excel and just like notepads and use cases of different things, but nobody actually reimagined the underlying use case of a desk in the way that Notion tries to do, right? And so I think technology as a tool is interesting if you try to represent culture and processes by understanding the people it's supposed to work for and the use case it's supposed to work for, right? And so and I think, like, obviously the way the pyramids were built was like atrocious and like and bad, but at the time it's such an interesting way to use the culture and processes of the time to build something that was unimaginable at that time as well. So it's like an interesting dichotomy of this thing. The same for the Taj Mahal as well, which is like, only 400 years ago.
I think it's interesting, like how democratizing like a lot of technology has been. Like I remember a few years ago when like there was like AOC was in the news a lot for like doing like Instagram stories of like all the behind the scenes you see at the Capitol building or in Congress that people had never seen before, or but it also, can be bad, like on Twitter. Where it's like, yes, like you can like communicate more directly with politicians and people representing you, but you can also have people spewing things that are just not true, as we've seen recently, and those companies can take a stand on whatever they want. So I think it's just interesting how this doesn't necessarily relate to culture and processes, but I think what Chabu was touching on before about, I forget what you said, but I know this made me think of it. So it's definitely interesting how that democratization can have positives and negatives.
Yeah, I think I don't want to say like before technology, because now we've established that like technology even started as soon as the printing press. But I think, say 100 years ago, it was easier to make a distinction, because if we're talking then I would say like culture and processes are more things that you participate in. And then I'm going to steal Chabu's definition and say like technology is tools. But now I almost think that a lot of times now culture is equated to technology. So I think of like memes and internet culture, and all of that exists within technology and because of technology. And so I think now it's even harder to make the distinction, because so much of it relies on like social media platforms and other forms of tech.
Yeah, and like I think where like I get stuck is like, if yes, like I definitely also see like technology as tools, but then like aren't processes also tools? Like isn't it like something that you are taking to different communities you're part of and like experimenting with them and using it as a way to get to the result that you want? Like I think processes like guide people towards like an end goal, and so like in that sense it is a tool as well. I guess like where like my head goes is that like I think about like the adoption process for, like adoption of technologies and then adoption of culture and processes, and I think about like how like it's very much like the same. I feel like things like converge, and once like you get a certain number of people doing it, like everybody is using it, like whether that is a technology or a process. And I feel like when that happens, like there needs to I mean, like, kind of going back to that Rethink Humanity report, like there needs to be new organizing systems designed to, you know, take into account what technologies and what processes people are using.
A thought that just crossed my mind is like when technology is built, like the people who build it exist within certain cultures and exist using certain processes. And like Mohit kind of brought this up already, talking about like the Egyptian pyramids and just like what was happening to have that built. And I think of like Facebook and the fact that it was like a really stupid dating app by like some problematic college kid. And like that is almost important to like, it makes me wonder if it's like the culture that Facebook was built on was very much to compare people and like very much to, you know, like almost like a tool to like express anger, because like that's kind of where like the Genesis story came from. And so I wonder if where the technology is built and the culture that it's like entrenched in has implications for its like long-term use, no matter how much the culture and processes evolve.
Oh wait, would you be down to talk a little bit about how crypto
Yeah.
bro culture shapes crypto bro tech?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting that you brought that up. That was one of the things I think when I think Madison was talking about. I guess this concept of the whole concept of technology as a tool that Chabu you mentioned. I think that's the baseline of technology, right? Like I think uh, actually what you said is true as well, right? Processes are also a form of, like, it's a tool, right? And it always comes down to what's the end goal with which you're developing something, right? And whether it's a form of technology, process, governance, structures, civics, it's interesting. And so this whole concept of blockchain and cryptocurrencies was always designed to be a tool for reaching something, right? Reaching an end goal of, in the case of cryptocurrencies, democratizing access to financing, to being able to transact, being able to actually, like, do something with it. The baseline for Bitcoin was the existence of actually figuring out how to get rid of the two-party problem, right? So when you have a banking system, the baseline is that you need a middleman to transact, right? And you need someone as a trusted third party who can make sure that the person has the money to be able to pay it. How do you get rid of that middleman problem is like the baseline with which cryptocurrency was invented. From cryptocurrency came blockchain technology. I think we're in an interesting place where in that space it's such a toxic environment that creates that middleman in a way that, because the people who create that technology inherently become the middleman in a way that's not the necessary outcome of what the technology was intended to do in the first place, right? And so it goes back to what I think we've been talking about in terms of, okay, is technology so heavily controlled by the people and time and place and culture that creates it in a way that shouldn't and doesn't translate well outside of that, or is it something that can be used in and extrapolated and iterated on, which has happened time and time again, right? And so I think like again, going back to, like, if you, and I think history is always the best place to look for answers in terms of how stuff develops. I think almost always when a technology is invented or put into use, first it has the adoption process, then it has the hugely massively negative influences across the board, right? Regardless of whether going back to the printing press example, right? Like the Roman Catholic Church, sorry, am I talking too much? Oh
no, that was I just said wow.
No. Yeah. Like the Roman Catholic Church used it for censorship for the 50 to 60 years. It used it for a way that to suppress knowledge, to try to hinder it, and then eventually translate it into actual good use cases, right? So I think given, like, if we look at the internet in context of history, it's so young, like it's still young, and cryptocurrency and blockchain is even younger. And so I think like use cases like this where I think conversely the flip side of it is also that because of the nature of technology in terms of the internet or cryptocurrency or blockchain, we're in this process of exponential growth and exponential history. Like everything's happening at, an exponential rate. It's not happening twice as fast or 10 times as fast. It's happening raised to n fast, right? And so every time that happens, like obviously the good use cases also come faster, but then the negative use cases also become compounded. So I think like as a like it's super interesting to look at it as a tool, and I think that's the way we should look at technology and treat it as such. I think treating it beyond that is where we start to fall into a trap. And I think one thing, Madison, that you mentioned, the last thing I'd say is like the thing that you said, like in terms of technology made the invention of things like memes possible. That's an interesting thing that stuck with me, because like if you look at the etymology of memes, again it comes from Greek, going back to what Leora was saying, but it just means like mimicking something, and then get that something that gets mimicked often enough becomes part of culture. And then Richard Dawkins actually popularized the current word of memes, which was before actual like widespread use of internet. So it's interesting how we like we conflate things in the present, because that's the reality of the present. And so it's interesting when we start to think about memes as something that the internet like internet or technology made possible. But it's at the end of the day, I think it's the tool that memified meme, like it actually like allowed it to become a meme. And so I think it's super interesting to look at the use cases in history.
Wow, that was a lot, but that was so good, and that makes me want to ask you a follow-up question. It makes me wonder. This is kind of like open-ended, but you talked about how technologies typically like in the first part that when they're like prevalent or around, they like tend to be negative and then like be turned for positive. So my question's twofold. It's like, do you think like the internet right now is like one of those like net negatives? And if so, what do you think could spark the turning point to make it used for positive?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had initial positive use cases that came out in a significant way. I think if you go back to the first sort of like internet bubble, the first real crash in the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw like a crazy boom and bust cycle. We saw it again in 2008, 2009. And then I think there's so many different use cases for the internet and technology right now that's exponentiating it. I think it's easier right now to start to break it up. Like I think breaking up the use case of each of those technologies is interesting. Like that's why I think it's interesting that Gary brought up blockchain and cryptocurrency, because it embodies a culture and an ethos that's separate from like the internet. And I think the internet has now evolved into a lot of different use cases, right? Like AI being one of them, or like blockchain being one of them. I think like just data and data science being one of them. I think robotics and actually like biomimicry and biorobotics being one of them. I think like starting to think about those different use cases as now the existence of technology, like today's technology, is more interesting. And then I think internet is sort of the layer that sits above or below all of those things, in terms of being able to make learning or transference of knowledge possible in a faster way, right? So I think the internet has reached a point of net positive. I think the others still have a long way to go, right? Like I think the like, especially if you look at the last year alone, like with the pandemic, I don't think half of what we do today would have been possible if the internet hadn't existed, right? Like in terms of where we're at, like if a pandemic happened, we wouldn't have been in a place where so many people would have been able to keep jobs from a positive perspective. Like, and I think the internet did its job in terms of that side of things. But I think the technology blocks built on top of it have a long way to go in terms of where we're at, is how I look at it, I think.
It's interesting. You're making me think of how Taiwan has had like double-digit deaths, like low double, like teens or something like that, from COVID in this past year. And they have access to the same technologies that we do, or ostensibly they do. But what's the differentiator? probably a lot of things, but one of them is like their civic culture. There's like a lot of more trust between the government and the people are more homogenous. And it's like there's a lot of factors that are different than America, smaller country, etc. But it makes me think of how much like, okay, if there's this much potential in where we are today, how much does culture play into closing that gap? And my guess is a lot.
I think that's like a really cool example, because when you look at like Taiwan and the US, the internet has actually created even more distrust in the government, while in Taiwan it's bridged a community of trust, and has allowed them to like really use the government to its full extent in helping them. And that's interesting, because when you think about like of all these new developments developing to a point of like having net positives, it may, like, I think we're so focused on developing the technology and furthering it, and not developing like the communities that interact and engage with the technology so that they can use it to its fullest extent.
Yeah, I definitely do think like culture is such a baseline for that stuff, right? I think like COVID has made it like more apparent than ever. I think in terms of where we're at. Like I'm from India. My mom just got COVID like last month, and she's fully fine now. But um, the immediate response of the people there is like my mom locked herself in a room in the house. The government sent folks over to the house to put a sticker on the door so no one in the, and like they informed the building that she has COVID. The building then contacted the government. The government sent folks over to make sure that no one in the house leaves the house for 14 days without getting tested. And I think like, it's just baseline. The idea is that the questioning of whether it's a good thing to do that for society is not even existing, right? Whereas like where we are today in the US, and we're hitting record numbers every day, and just the culture of that has been perpetuated by the culture that identifies as American, like, right? And what does it mean to be that in today's day and age, in terms of what does it even mean to be American, if that's the baseline, if you're talking about COVID as a thing that's not, that's a questionable thing to do, right? Like that I can walk around and my freedom is at stake. And I think like Asian countries, countries led by women in so many cases, have proven that culture from a top down and bottom up use case makes such a big difference in terms of how technology is able to facilitate the outcomes, right? Like technology can only go that far if culture doesn't like allow it to be facilitated that way.
This is really interesting because in so many ways I'm like a product of the internet. Obviously I'm my own person, but I've grown up so much with the internet, and to like look at that from a critical lens when it's something that's so entrenched in my life is a really fascinating thing to do. Like I read a whole book just about the linguistics of the internet and how it's kind of revolutionized informal language now that people can be informal with each other all the time. So I mean, it's kind of a hard like self look and be like, yeah, I love the internet, but is it really good for the rest of the world? And that, like, this thing of Taiwan is really interesting because obviously in that case it was so useful, but the rest of the world hasn't been as fast.
I guess, okay, so I'm still trying to like learn about this, but I guess what I think about is like, I just feel like there's room for like the internet as a whole to be upgraded, right? So like I was reading something that said like right now we are like in like web 2.0, which means that it's essentially like read write internet, where like people can like read things on the internet and you can like write things to the internet, and it's like it basically stores information as like a database. But then like the next step of the internet is really like, how do you like decentralize the internet? So like we're entering a time of like more and more data. And so like, you know, like with like Taiwan and like COVID and stuff, it's like, well, like how do you like track people and make sure that like if people like got in contact with someone, like they're like told that they like met someone who had COVID, and like how do you like do all that while making sure you're storing like all this like data in a way that like respects people's privacy, and like that it's stored safely, and that it's like validated across like different sources. And so like I guess like I just also think about like a need for like internet to be upgraded to be able to deal with all of these new technologies and like use them in effective ways. Yeah, and I think like that's something that Taiwan has started to figure out how to do.
Cool. Now we can go ahead and move on to the reflection and application section. I'm going to send the notes in the Zoom chat so that you all can look over them. And when you have a reflection, feel free to shout it out.
And anyone that didn't jump in on any of these questions, feel free to add anything as well.
Can someone tell me a little bit about the reflection piece, like in terms of what that entails or what that means?
Yeah, so you can just like look over the notes. You can kind of like solidify your key takeaways that you got from this conversation, things that surprised you or that maybe you want to think more about going into the future, anything like that.
Thank you. So for me, the meme thing really stuck with me. I don't know why, but it was an interesting. It encapsulated a lot of what we were talking about. So the way Richard Dawkins defined meme was as a unit of cultural transmission, in terms of like the smallest possible unit of cultural transmission, right? And so I think going back to Gary's question, or I don't know what it's called,
Provocation.
Yeah, provocation about culture affecting technology. I think the baseline is that culture really determines how technology can be used, right? I think it's the thread that ties a lot of our conversation together, whether it's Taiwan dealing better with the same tools, or because everyone like in theory at least, obviously it's not equal or not absolute, but everyone has access to the same tools at a governmental level, right? Like especially if you compare the United States to Taiwan, and the outcomes are so different. And so that stems from culture, and that stems from how culture is determined to direct democracy. And I think that's the baseline. Like at the end of the day, technology is a tool. Yes, I think Ashley, what you said about what does Internet 3.0 look like? What does the next iteration of the tool look like? I agree with that, right? But I think culture is what determines where that ends up at, right? And decentralization is this buzzword that have been around multiple times in the blockchain space and the cryptocurrency space, but it never materializes the way it's supposed to, right? White papers are one thing, but actual use case of deploying that is another thing. And so I think at the end of the day, culture really determines how technology can be used. Like I think that's what it comes back to.
Well said.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I was actually reading this like feminist critique of blockchain, and like I didn't realize like just how like I don't know, like inequitable the space was, in a sense that like what I think it's like 96% of Bitcoin is owned by like 4% of miners or something. And like that just kind of blew my mind. I'm like, that's like essentially like every other currency that exists out there, like power centralizes, and like just like blockchain is not going to be decentralized if it's not like built in that way. And so I definitely agree there. I think like throughout the track, what became really clear to me was that like culture and processes really shape how people use tech, and like it's really important to start there.
I think my main takeaway is from the track is just that I really need to rethink what I consider to be technology. And I think like reframing that is going to help me think about what should happen with it in the future, because like the first thing, the printing press comment was like so eye-opening to me, and thinking about culture and processes as tech also just totally threw me for a loop. So I think just reframing how we think about technology in general is what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, similar to Leora, I think this conversation's really changed like how I define and see technology, especially going forward. It's really helpful like to have it put into context with history, and also to think about how new things like the internet are, because like Leora mentioned, like when you've been immersed in it for your entire lifetime, you don't really think about how short of a lifespan it has had. And so to think about how rapidly that has changed, as we were talking about before this conversation started, like there's things going on all the time. Like every single week, there's huge events that are happening in large part because of what the internet has afforded. And so it's insane to think about long-term, you know, what has happened in just this year and what will happen over the next decade, and what technology will allow, especially as it expands and improves. So that can be scary to think about, but it also kind of makes me, Gary, do you think it'd be awkward to pose kind of like another question in this section? You think that'd be cool?
Go for it.
Okay, so it makes me wonder, kind of like to round this, like to finish this off, how can we optimize tech and democracy?
I kind of want to like add to that question too. It's kind of like the same thing. Also, probably something for Gary to like answer. Like back to my point that I made in the very beginning. Our like how our government's day-to-day operations being so behind on tech, and like the talent is going to the Googles and the Facebooks. How do you think like the government can position itself for top talent to want to go into the government right away?
It's a great question. I can take an initial stab at this. So to everyone's point, you know, and just to kind of underline Mohit's direct quote, culture determines how technology can be used. I was actually just talking to one of Josh and Mohit's former colleagues who comes to the office sometimes, Bob, about like, when is the right time to start building a technology for a community? And well, if you don't know what the community needs and what the goals are, you don't know what the culture of that community is, it's not set yet, and you don't necessarily know what they want yet, you're certainly not ready. And so how do we create technology that serves our democracy? I think it starts here. I really do. I really think it starts with organizations, communities like Civics Unplugged, and that also answers the second question. I don't think it's going to come from the government. There's no trust in the government right now, and in order to get into high positions of power right now, the 99% pathway is to kind of be a partisan crony, and I don't think Gen Z is inspired by that. So we are a civic/political org in our own ways, but it's because of our independence from government that I think we have any credibility with any of you. So those are my thoughts.
That's awesome. I think a couple of things on that. I think what you said about it, like understanding the needs and then doing the building, right? I think that's super strong. Like I think what's important to note in, like, I think analogous to that, or like right next to that, is that also you can never know the whole thing. Like there's no omniscient like knowledge in terms of like knowing something about a culture or what a culture needs, right? So at the end of the day, I think the good thing about technology as a tool is also you can build and break and iterate and build and break and iterate, right? And I think that's also important, to take those leaps and to just jump out there and do the building, right? Like it may not, like you'll never know for sure 100% if this is going to be the right thing, if this is going to be the end thing. There might be negative outcomes from it, but if you don't put yourself out there, if you don't put the invention out there, you don't move forward, right? And I think that's important to understand. And then adding that to Gary, your definition of like, you know, current government, which I don't think is wrong in any way, but I do think it's the pathway for your guys' generation to make the change, right? I think having these kinds of conversations, I know, like if you look at history again, in terms of like actual systemic change only happens step by step, bit by bit, if it's supposed to be peaceful, right? If it's supposed to be in a way that's taking the conversation forward, it doesn't, the only other alternative is revolution or war, right? Those are the only times that, and then that almost always entails violence. So if you ever find yourself in that place, the idea is like, you know, conversations like these is the small steps to move towards actual change. And I think, yes, government is broken, and maybe more broken than it has been in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But I would say just always zoom out, right? And see where you are and see what you can learn from those mistakes, those steps that history has shown us, and then try to take those small steps towards actually making change. And I think Civics Unplugged is a great place to start for sure.
Yeah, I don't think government has ever been like a hotbed for innovation. And I say that knowing that my dad works at a place that's federally funded that develops technology, coincidentally enough. But I think like to a certain degree, I don't know if like the government can position itself in a way that top talents will want to join. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's not necessarily the government's job. I think outside, like organizations like Civics Unplugged can do that. Kind of reminds me that like oftentimes my school has had a hard time finding good math and science teachers because so many people who get those degrees like go off and work in the private sector instead of becoming teachers in those things. So it's like it's a tricky business, basically.
I think this is a great question. And I think that I touched on this a little bit earlier, but to optimize tech and democracy, I think that we need to spend less time like investing in developing more tech, because like that's happening at warp speed, and spend more time investing in developing like the communities and people who engage with the tech. And I think that when you exist in a culture where like self-development is so key, and like things that you have natural energy for or like excite you are the foundation of the conversation, everyone's going to want to do that. And so when I think about how the government can position itself for top talent, I again kind of agree with Leora in the sense that like that's not really the government's role. More so, how can the democracy movement position itself for top talent? And the way to do that is to make it so that like it's almost like a process of self-expression, it's self-development, it's very much aligned with like what you're passionate about. For the same reason that everyone wants to become a YouTuber, because like you just get to live your life and happen to like be doing some contribute to society. I think that like democracy reform can have that same like, you know, exciting way where like it feels natural to participate. and it feels informative of yourself to like keep developing democracy as well as yourself, which again is totally in line with what we do here.
I love that, Chabu. It also like makes me think that like just like changing it from like government to democracy, and like it really shouldn't just be like top talents either. It should be like we should be trying to attract everyone to participate in democracy and to make their own kinds of contributions. And again, we've talked about this before, but like I really like the idea of changing civic engagement, and how we like perceive it right now. Max, do you have any reflections, any thoughts?
I do. And sorry, I'm so late to all of this. Kind of what Madison had mentioned. And you know what people have mentioned before in terms of positioning yourselves in like the U-shaped hole, as you know the fellowship put it. I don't really feel like it's even that that tech needs to be like this huge thing. I think it can just be a tool along the way to getting democracy to be a better, American democracy to be better. You know, in terms of whether it's increasing civic engagement, civic education, emphasis on participation. Like we have so many ways to reach out to people, and organizations like Civics Unplugged and When We All Vote, and even like TED Talks have proven this, that it's not very hard to make stuff accessible to people. I think we just need to use it and to put that effort into to making it available.
Abigail, any reflection, thoughts?
This is sort of just like adding on to what other people have said, but I agree with what Mohit said about like culture determining how technology could be used in our democracy, and I feel like they're just also interconnected. I don't know. I don't have time to time to unpack that, but yeah, they're also interconnected, and yeah, I don't I don't know where I was going with that, but
yeah, well, they shape each other, and that's I think step one in helping the feedback loops go in the right direction, or a slightly more direction related to flourishing. It starts with us recognizing just how recognizing as systems thinkers that they really afford each other's evolution or devolution, right?
I just want to add one last thing. I know, in terms of what you said, Leora, and I think that notes there, which is kind of bothering me, but government has never been a hotbed for innovation. I think that's interesting. I think like my generation included, your generation. I don't know what the generational changes, what the cutoff is anymore, but I think government is not the hotbed for innovation, but it's the facilitator for civilization being hotbeds for innovation, and it's a tool, right? Government is a tool that is a hotbed for innovation. You guys have Benjamin Franklin as an astronaut on one of your these things, right? Going to the moon, whether it's DARPANET with the internet, whether it's the global positioning system, GPS, like vaccines, any of the stuff that we see, that what the motives are, what the outcomes are, um, maybe negative again, right? Like especially, and the invention might be negative to begin with or used for defense, but it's the place where it is the facilitator of innovation, right? And and it needs people like you to go into there to actually avoid as many of those negative outcomes at the start as possible, right? And to avoid as many of those negative use cases and actually go towards the positive as fast as possible.
I think my reflection would be I really liked the statement about process and culture being technology. I think, again, because how many of us grow up when we think of technology, our thoughts go right to like phones, computers, and more like futuristic imagery, I'd say. But it's important to break it down into how technology started and how it evolved. So I liked that quote.
Yeah, this is a super good conversation. Anyone have any last thoughts to add before we wrap up? Josh, you have anything to add? I know you've been spectating for a while.
Yeah, thanks for calling me out like that. No, I mean, not necessarily to add, and you may have touched upon it, but that whole idea, right, that tech civics is intertwined, and I just want to remove it, like as Julia just mentioned, of like we usually think about like futuristic things, and it's like really confusing to me right now when I turn on anything of Congress and like we're grilling Facebook or Twitter or any of those new companies about their role in democracy, because they were never founded to be part of democracy, right? Like Facebook was founded literally to publicly shame who's hot and who's not. Twitter was founded to put up 100 and whatever characters. So like, why are we grilling them about democracy and not like grilling General Motors, who created a new version of car, who doesn't provide cars for free on days that we need to vote? To like, that's a technological revolution. So I'm just confused of like who we're trying to hold accountable and who we're trying to say is like intertwined in our democracy if they weren't actually founded upon civic principles. So that's just a lot of what's top of mind for me.
To that point, I think Jack Dorsey put out like a 10 tweet thread like 2 or 3 hours ago, like addressing basically that question, which I haven't read all of them yet, but it'd be interesting to look at.
And it's interesting that Jack Dorsey this morning expressed his interest in Civics Unplugged. So like, is that is that convenient, or is he actually like moving in that direction? That's cool.
Yeah.
Love what Josh said. And that reminded me of speaking of tools, like humans are the most flexible tools ever. And we don't put blame on ourselves for why our democracy sucks. Like we have the ability to do whatever. We have the ability to build new tools. We have the ability to convince more people to contribute constructively. So maybe like instead of just spending all our time blaming Zuckerberg, we can take it upon ourselves as the most flexible tools ever to do something about it.
I think that's a really cool point, because you speak to the fact that I never really looked at it like that before, Josh, but it's almost like a convenient scapegoat to turn to the like tech companies and be like, this is your fault. But in reality, like there wouldn't be so much political issues taking place in social media platforms if the government was functioning as it should. Like people wouldn't have anything to talk about on social media if you know, they were doing their jobs well. So instead of being a provocation for self-reflection, it was just like, let's, you know, interrogate them and, you know, place the blame on them. And I think that's really unfortunate, but the truth in this case.
Right. Like what if the Russians were actually trying to tear down American democracy, but yet we were all like, yo, actually, it's so great. And my elected official actually was doing all of these wonderful things. It's a total paradigm shift.
Yeah, Chabu, that's a great point. Oh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, sorry, it's just super quick. When you talked about how like tech kind of like reveals things that are like kind of like going wrong in our democracy, I kind of like draw a parallel to the pandemic, because the pandemic exacerbated and created like more issues, but it also like revealed a lot of underlying issues as well. And so I think that, you know, while it has created, both of them really just show like fundamental flaws within our democracy, which I don't know, there's a lot to be said about that as well. But Max, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I also kind of what Gary said about humans being the most flexible tools kind of struck me, because we spend a lot of time, and other people have mentioned this too, placing the blame on other people. And that's, you know, valid. but at the same time, we can really only control ourselves. We can only tell ourselves what to do, and we have so much ability to make change if we actually like put our time into it, that I feel like we could all, or at least a lot of us, could be more productive in our participation in democracy, instead of, instead of being like, oh, you shouldn't have done this. Look at what can I do to prevent you from doing this a second time, stuff like that.
Yeah. And what I'll add to that is it's really hard. I mean, I've had really good conversations with this one leader of Points of Light, which is George H.W. Bush's nonprofit, who wants to work with us on some events, potentially on Juneteenth. And their whole thing is like, let's demystify what civic contribution could look like. And that's right in line with so much of what we're doing, especially what Chabu and Madison are doing with the Unplugged School of Process. Like really just kind of explicate what are the things that are relevant to leadership development. What are the processes that are relevant to leadership development and better communities and better democracies? So, I mean, it's kind of just to go back to the point of the role of Civics Unplugged. I think we have a huge role to play to enable humans to be the tools that build democracy that they can be. So it's also important for us to not blame other people for choosing the ways of being civically engaged that they literally see on Twitter, because I have to admit that was my route as well, and it was deeply unfulfilling after a while. But if there's no other path, yeah, it's really hard to blame people.
This is very cool. The conclusion of the past couple of treks have reminded me of this quote that I really like, that I really resonate with in terms of CU. It's trust me now, understand me later. And a lot of things that happen in CU, like they make sense like at first, but the more that you dig into it, it makes like even more sense. You start to understand it even more. And so I bring that up because the past couple of conversations, we've gotten back to like, it starts with me, which is what we started with in January in the fellowship, when we were talking about personal development and trying to grow yourself. And that theme has only, become reinforced more and more. And as we understand, it only makes more sense. And so I think that's the coolest thing. And it really just validates the work that we're doing here and the approach that we're taking to building the future. And so, yeah, I think that we can wrap up on that note. Thank you all for coming. Again, such an amazing conversation. Thank you again, Mohit, for joining us, and Josh as well. Would love to have you all back at a future trek. We're starting to have these about 3 times a week now. So there's going to be plenty in the future if you want to hop on one.
Thank you guys so much for having me. Really appreciate it. And would love to hop on others. And then I'm excited to be part of this 10-year journey or lifetime journey with Civics Unplugged. And Gary's my point of contact, and Josh is my point of contact, but would be happy to open that up to all of you guys as well in terms of being available and working with you guys on anything and everything, even if it's just a conversation.
100%. Thank you, Mohit.
Thank you guys.
Everyone.
Yeah. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your night. Bye.
Thank you.